Welcome to Follow the Medical Record, where healthcare experts give insights into the increasing importance of following a patient's medical record through the health ecosystem with compliance, privacy, security, and efficiency front and center. This podcast is brought to you by MRO and hosted by Don Hardwick, Senior Vice President of Client Relations at MRO. Don has been in the health information management industry for over 40 years and has extensive knowledge of how medical records make their way through the healthcare ecosystem. At MRO, Don is responsible for strategic client engagement programs and overall client satisfaction. To hear from all of MRO's industry experts, be sure to visit mrocorp.com for additional content and to sign up for our monthly e-newsletter. Over to you, Don.
Welcome to Follow the Medical Record as we journey through the many aspects of the healthcare industry and its interconnection with the medical record. I'm your host, Don Hardwick. Thanks for listening in today. As always, you can learn more about MRO on our website at mrocorp.com. I normally have as a subject matter expert someone from the industry as my guest to discuss various aspects of the healthcare industry, and today is no exception. Today we'll be talking to MRO's Chief Technology Officer, Mark Thomas, about developing an IT culture for high production, and second, how that culture then translates to sustaining high productivity in the staff. So, Mark, welcome to the show, and thanks for joining today.
Yeah, thanks, Don. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk with you today. Super excited about it.
So tell our listeners a little bit, if you would, Mark, about your background before we get into the subject.
Sure. I've been a technologist and honestly a mathematician my whole life. But my love for technology started, I think, in the fourth grade when I got my first Apple IIe, dating myself a little bit there. But have really spent my whole life working with software, designing systems, leading teams. I believe I got my first software developer team in around 1999 and have just spent the last 25 years leading technology teams varying in sizes from small to very large. Have had a couple of previous CIO roles in healthcare prior to joining MRO. Joined MRO a couple of years ago with the real focus of transforming our technology organization into a more modern organization and one that really drives MRO's position in the industry.
Mark, thanks. So today it's different than, not going back to when you were in the fourth grade or not that quite that far back, but you've been driving IT productive groups for many, many years. And that's the kind of the crux of what I want to talk about today is how you've developed your philosophy on managing, as they say, herding cats, it sounds like most of the time. How have you developed your philosophy, and what do you see as the winning culture that you've been able to now translate that over into a very high productive environment with the demand on not only producing, quality output in the IT industry, but also not just that quality, but the demand for timing of that product is much, much different today than it was, 20 years ago. So how has that translated? How have you translated your culture over to this environment today?
Yeah, I appreciate that question. It really starts with the fact that healthcare is changing. It's changing. It's moving from being a manual and disconnected environment to really becoming much more of an ecosystem where all of our systems, there's a desire for them to be automated, connected, for our systems and our data to be proactive. And so companies that are healthcare companies, honestly, really have to go through this transformation. They have to go from being, potentially technology-enabled healthcare companies to really being technology companies that are operating in what I call a connected healthcare ecosystem. There's a strong desire for our data to just freely move across the ecosystem, and that puts a really unique challenge on the technology teams in order to enable that. And so, my philosophy is really boils down to this. I have this. Being a mathematician, I can't get away from it, but I have this thing I call Mark's theorem of architecture. And Mark's theorem of architecture goes like this. It essentially says that culture will drive the architecture of your systems. Okay. It seems to be a little bit of a foreign concept for most technologists, but so I was a chief architect at a healthcare company several years ago, and I had developed a beautiful architecture, but was frustrated on why we were not getting that architecture delivered. And I just couldn't figure out why. So I was doing some research, and I happened to be reading a book called Accelerate, written by Nicole Forsgren. And in that book, she talked about a study that was commissioned by Martin Fowler. And that study was on performance-oriented culture. It was done by Westrom. And what Westrom proved in that study was that performance-oriented culture predicts communication flow in an organization. Why does that matter? Well, that was the light bulb moment, because as a technologist, we're all familiar with a law called Conway's Law. Conway's Law says that an organization will produce systems that mimic its communication flow or its organizational structure. And so we try to build our teams around that concept. But the light bulb moment was when I read about the culture driving communication patterns. Because what that really means is when you put those two things together, it says that culture will predict communication flow, and communication flow therefore predicts the architecture that you get. Light bulb moment. So at that moment, I changed my approach. I went from trying to govern, if you will, and really work top down to get the architecture that we needed to start working bottom up with the culture in our organization. And literally, I coined our teams. We went from being enterprise architects to culture architects. And we really started to drive the culture that would enable the modern architecture that we needed. And so when you look at what that modern architecture is to be a part of this healthcare ecosystem, the modern architecture ask is for the architecture to be flexible. Our systems have to be flexible to enable speed. They have to be predictable to enable business decisions. Our technologies have to be composable to enable future undefined products. But again, healthcare is ever changing. Our technologies need to be embeddable. We've got to meet our clients in their world. Our technologies have to be available. Let's be clear. All business hours are all hours today, 24/7. Our technology has to be there, and our architecture has to be there. They have to be scalable to enable vast amounts of growth, whether it's data or transaction volume or number of people interacting with our systems. And they have to really be user-focused to maximize that value. So when I look at that, so that's the ask. That's what a modern architecture needs to be, have the characteristics. So what culture, if Mark's theorem of architecture is true, I've got to have a culture, put in place a culture that's going to deliver that architecture. So in order to have a flexibility, I've got to have a culture that embraces change. In order to be predictable, I have to have a culture that's data-driven. In order to be composable, I have to have technologies that are grouped into features and functions that make sense, that can plug and play with each other. In order to have technologies that are embeddable, I have to have teams that are collaborative and are willing to work with other clients or with other partners on how to embed our technology with theirs or vice versa. If our technology is going to be available, I've got to have a culture of extreme ownership. Our teams have to be in the mindset of our systems have to be available all the time. In order to have scalable technologies, I've got to have what I call telemetry everywhere. I've got to monitor every single piece of our environment in order to focus so that we understand the things that are limiting our scalability. That's how you ultimately drive broader scalability. And then if we're going to be user focused, we have to have a culture that really embraces routine inspection of what we're delivering. So, our teams, Our teams deliver some instances every week, some instances every 2 weeks. I don't believe we have any Scrum teams that are working on longer cycles, but what that means is every week or every 2 weeks, we're looking at the software we're building and getting feedback on it. Is it right? Does it need to change? The only way to remain user focused is get that constant feedback. That's a kind of a beautiful picture of a culture and organization, but why is that really hard? And why was I struggling? And why is that hard in most technology organizations? And this has been the case for every technology organization I've been involved with over the last several years. But the bottom line is the technology organizations were built to be protectionists. So when the term IT became a thing and became an organization, companies were investing millions of dollars in pieces of hardware that would fill up rooms. And we needed to protect those investments. So you didn't want to make a change to those pieces of equipment, whether it was software or hardware, that was going to break anything. And so the whole mindset around the technology organizations was around protecting, not enabling, right? And so when that protectionist mindset led to specialization. So only people with specialized skills could touch certain parts of the system. Well, that specialization led to silos in the organization. You only had certain people with certain skills could only do certain jobs. Those silos lead to architecture boundaries. Those architecture boundaries lead to the need to have handoffs. Well, this is the key. Handoffs destroy our speed and create opportunities for miscommunication and inefficiency. And furthermore, there were few people really understood our systems end to end. All of which, when you think about all of those things, they're pretty much the opposite of the modern architecture and the modern culture that I described, right? And it was for all the right reasons that those things that again, the history of the IT organization came about. But we're in a time where we've got to turn that on its head. And that's been my focus here at MRO, and really the core of what I call the transformation playbook, and how we've transformed our technology organization to really be delivering on our modern architecture.
So what do you see is an undermining factor that would disrupt that cultural environment? And how do you safeguard against those influences that would undermine that culture?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's a couple of key pieces that I think really enable the modern technology organization. One of them is introducing the concept of talent first management, and really introduce. So one of the things that we've done is we've taken kind of the traditional mindset of, you take a talented individual and they're great at their job, and we want to give them a promotion path. So we promote them into being a manager and a people leader. And in a lot of cases, they are ill-equipped to do that job very well. We don't train them to be managers, and frankly, their skills are technical driven. And just because they're good at that doesn't mean that they'll be good at people leaders. So we've turned that on its head, and we were like, that's okay. We allow in our organization the concept for someone to have a very robust and long-lived career and achieve all of their dreams as an individual contributor. If that's what they're good at, that's what they do. We have other people in our organization whose job it is really to be talent first management and manage our talent. And talent managers, their job is to make sure our teams have the right skills and the right culture to deliver what's being asked. They are also the stewards of what we call technical excellence and measuring how our teams are doing. So really, when I think about the biggest thing that can detract from this transformation is not having the right people in the right roles. And a big unlocking factor there is focusing on splitting that and saying, it's okay, we're going to hire deliberately for people that are good at making people decisions and driving skills and looking at the skills that we have and how we upskill the team, and split that from the actual technical, the engineers that are doing the job. And it's not a fair statement to say no one can be promoted from being an individual contributor and a manager. That's not what I'm saying. There are some people that follow that path and do a great job. What I'm saying is it's not everyone. It's not for everyone. And so we take a very deliberate approach to how we manage the talent on our teams and the culture associated with those teams and what we measure. So just really having the wrong people in the wrong seats on the bus are oftentimes the biggest barrier to getting that done.
So is this kind of a deviation from promotion? In most companies, the way people get promoted is by managing, as you're saying, broader spectrum of individual contributors. And many times you have very talented individual contributors that you believe would be promotable, but that promotion requires managing other individual contributors, which that doesn't always work. So I think in general, we end up promoting people to the highest level of incompetence if we don't get them into that proper role that you're talking about. So how have you been able to identify the difference between that promotable manager and a promotable independent contributor, and keep the distinction there?
That's a great question, Don. I appreciate you asking it. So step one to solving that problem is we create a career architecture that supports both paths. Okay. And so we create a career architecture that says, okay, you're an individual engineer at a certain level, and here's what it means to be an individual contributor at the next level, and so on up to, and don't quote me on all our titles in our architecture, but in the individual contributor path, it ends, the highest level is the concept of what we call like a lead principal or a principal engineer. And so that is someone who's recognized as the highest level of technical competence to the point where they're influencing organizational wide technology in some avenue, whether it is software development, it might be specific to like AI, it might be specific to cloud or something, but they are influencing the entire organization to be considered at that lead principal level. But what that means is that's the equivalent to like a senior director, someone who has multiple layers of management underneath them, right? When you think about compensation and all of those other kinds of things, but there's just an individual contributor because, and we literally, it's as simple. It all starts with just asking the questions on what people want to do. Do you really want to be a manager, or do you want to continue down the technical excellence path? Because one of the things we found, it was interesting. We did this experiment long ago where we had a couple of different teams that were focused on some new technology. One team was focused on new technology, and another team was focused on some old technology, and neither one of them were performing. And it didn't make sense on paper. Well, then we just went and surveyed them and asked the question, what technology do you want to be working on? Well, interestingly enough, they both pointed it in the other direction. So we literally switched the teams. Had nothing to do with skills on the team. It had to do with desire. And as soon as we switched the teams, and then we got the team that wanted to be working on the new fancy technology and the other team that wanted to be working on some of the tried and true stuff, they immediately doubled their production from both teams, even though neither one of them had the specific skills in each of those technologies, just because they wanted to be working on them. So I view the same type of mindset associated with whether or not you're an individual contributor in technology or whether you want to be a people leader. We lay out what it means to be a people leader and what the expectation is of talent management and influence in the organization and impact. And we ask people, is that a job that you want to work towards? And if it is, then we help people work towards it. And there are paths where you can promote from individual contributor to manager and vice versa. But just by providing the transparency of those different paths, people start to to select in to which path they want to be a part of. And it also boils down to deliberate skills measurement. So we have a really deliberate process to measuring how people's skills in the different areas. And so some people fit better in those areas than others, and that's okay. It takes all of us to get where we want to get.
Mark, this is interesting because I know that in the sphere that you manage, you guys produce on a very rapid pace products and enhancement to products that's almost unheard of. And you're able to do that in an environment that has typically taken much longer to accomplish than what your teams are doing today. And part of it is that you've gotten the right people in the right spots. And that example that you gave where the two teams were misaligned in what their interest was, and finding that interest and then putting those people with that same interest accelerates the production. And it's almost unheard of in some industries, and certainly in this industry, because people do get pegged in certain categories, and that's where they're sort of going to stay. But that may not be where they're interested. It's just because they have experience in that area, but little interest. And when you get the interest and experience, gosh, you got a home run.
Yeah, it does seem like sometimes you're like, wow, what I'm talking about is just kind of common sense, but it's really easy to get lost in the myriad of management advice out there and all those kinds of things, and forget about the basics. And there's just a whole. My team and I have this thing we call the playbook, which is a lot of what I'm talking about here, kind of written down in some briefing charts and so forth, and just reminds us the kinds of questions we need to be asking and the kinds of operating mechanisms that we need to be implementing with the team so that we don't forget. But a lot of it is common sense. It really is. It's rooted in, look, leading teams is all rooted in people. And they're just certain fundamentals of humans and how humans interact that's tried and true. And a lot of people will tell you technology teams are different. Well, from that perspective, they're not. The only thing that's different about technology teams is that we're dealing with a specific set of skills because of the types of work that we do and the technologies that we interact with. But at the foundation of how we lead those teams is a lot of common sense from the standpoint of just measure how our teams are doing, measure desire and what they want to be a part of, and then help people go achieve that. And one of the really cool things that starts to happen in this transformation is accountability shifts. So I will say, as we're kind of wrapping things up today, one of the fundamental changes we make in the organization is we change what we call the accountability model. We move away from the concept of, in technology, the concept of project management was really kind of born in technology and in my opinion, became a crutch. I would really run across teams. They're like, oh, we can't work on this until we get a project manager stood up and to organize us. And I just firmly believe that's not the case. I think we're all capable of driving towards outcomes. And so kind of eliminating the concept of having someone else be accountable for what we're delivering and having the teams themselves and the individuals themselves be focused on the outcomes that we're trying to achieve and being accountable to achieving those outcomes is really the key to scaling and scaling this in a big way. Don, you talked about some of the speed that we get, and we've quadrupled the number of releases that we've done this year, and I don't even know what the math is, but we've gone from 50% of our releases potentially having some sort of quality issue that we needed to address and clean up later to 2 out of, I think, 290 releases last year having that issue. So not only did we quadruple or multiply our speed times 6, we increase quality 50-fold or whatever that number is. I should probably do the math, but it's a significant improvement, and that's just because of the fundamental accountability model changing. Our engineers take pride in what they're delivering. We get them focused on the outcomes, and again, that's part of that culture that we're creating. One of the culture pillars that I talked about was extreme ownership, right, and being data driven. And so those two things together, there's nowhere to hide, right? We've got an incredible level of transparency, and we're constantly inspecting the work that's coming out of the machine. And so engineers take pride in that, and they want their stuff to be well thought of. And we're not hiding behind project managers that are managing that. We're providing a level of visibility on that. And it's just super key to getting this transformation to kind of take a life of its own.
Mark, I really do appreciate your insight here, and I'd like to follow up with a kind of a part 2 of this, because I would like to drill into a little bit more of the detail of the accountability and how you use the culture that you've developed to drive these improved outcomes. So I'd like to ask you to come back on the show as a part 2 to this, if you wouldn't mind, and let's drill into the actual production of that environment, of how you've developed. This first step is the culture driven approach, but then how that is translating into higher productivity with fewer errors, all because of that culture. So I would really like to have you back on the show again.
Absolutely. Sounds great. Looking forward to it.
Well, thanks again. It's been a pleasure having you. And I believe this really does give our audience some insight into the high-tech demand in the healthcare sector. So to our listeners, for more insight on a patient's medical record and how it intersects with the healthcare ecosystem, visit the show's page at MRO CORP, and be sure to explore our additional resources and thought leadership on the website. Please check out our program on healthcarenowradio.com. And finally, be sure to connect with us on Twitter at MRO CORP. Until we talk again, I'm your host, Don Hardwick.